Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, today we have Matthew Farber. Matthew, the first thing is if you are prepared to engage.
Make it so, yes.
Let's do this. Let's go for it. So the first thing that we want to know is, who is Matthew Farber? And if you haven't known still who he is, he's an educational doctor and assistant professor of technology, innovation, and pedagogy at the University of Northern Colorado. His research is at the intersection of teacher education, learning technologies, and game-based learning. Dr. Farber has been invited to the White House to twice keynote for the UNESCO, and he has been interviewed about games and learning by NPR, Fox News Radio, Denver Post, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal, and today in Professor Game Podcast. He's also an Edutopia blogger, a certified BrainPOP educator, and he is in the iCivics Educator Network. And with Karen Schrier, he also co-authored the UNESCO MGIEP working paper, The Limits and Strengths of Using Digital Games as Empathy Machines. He also has a couple of books. One of them is called Gamify Your Classroom, a field guide to game-based learning, and it's in its second edition, which features a foreword from Greg Toppo, a past guest of the podcast. He's also co-editor of the Game Jam Guide, and his second book and latest book is Game-Based Learning in Action: How an Expert Affinity Group Teaches with Games, and this one has a foreword from James Paul He. Matt, is there anything that we missed from this intro?
No. Seems pretty complete.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pretty complete. Quite a few things to talk about today, and that makes it interesting to go into the first question. And we have heard all these fantastic things that you're doing, and many of the people in the audience, in the engagers, are wondering, what does a regular day, or if there's no such a thing as a regular day, maybe a regular week, look like with Matthew Farber?
It looks like there's no work-life balance, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, I'm studying games, how games work, but particularly games as experiences, not just like, you get 3 stars and this amount of experience points and you get to do this, but like the whole experience of a game. So, I mean, that is in a lot of things. Like, but we took a trip to Disneyland last summer, and I can't switch my brain off from like, the experience of being transported away into these certain lands, right? So yeah, it's hard to disconnect from work-life balance when the latest app on your phone might be something to study, right? So yeah, I mean, I guess there is no typical week. Prior to teaching here at the University of Northern Colorado, I was a middle school history teacher. And, if you teach in K-12, there's a much more regimented daily schedule than in higher education. You're in higher education, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So not to interview the interviewer, but so as you know, in higher education, your workload, so I have to be in class at certain times, right? 60% of my work is teaching, but the other 20 and 20 are research and service. But I'm always doing research, and I'm always, on some sort of like Slack channel or this, right? So, yeah, it's just basically constant, which is fine. It's all good.
I'm trying to remember who it was that mentioned it. It was one of these big names in entrepreneurship, that he was saying that there's the whole work-life balance is, and he used a word that I'm not going to use in this podcast, but that it doesn't make sense, basically, that there's when you find something that a purpose is something that you're passionate about and that is going to make a difference for you and for the world, then what you want to make sure is that you are aligned with that purpose and that thing that you're building into. And it sounds like that's where you're building towards, Matt.
Yeah, I guess if I reflect on that, and I have done that before, that makes sense. Prior to being even a K-12 teacher, I had a job in finance. and it was commission based, and really the whole thing was about extrinsic rewards, and I just didn't like it. I liked at the time some of the people I worked with, not everybody, but some of the people, and that got me through, I guess. But I wasn't so motivated by the rewards, even though they were monetary rewards. It just wasn't like a meaningful work. Like games are described as meaningful work, and to me, not to everybody, but to me, that wasn't meaningful work. Whereas teaching to me is meaningful work, particularly designing lessons and doing research, talking to people like yourself. To me, that's great. It's meaningful, so I don't even realize I'm working. So yeah, I buy into that. I'm fortunate to be doing what I love.
That's fantastic. That's phenomenal, and it's very interesting all the shifts that you've given in your life, and I think it's a very interesting experience to come from such different backgrounds and to be able to look back into those things and see how the rewards and the motivation was and where it was coming from, where it was not coming from, how and why did your life shift. I think it's a very, very interesting thing to look at as well.
Yeah, it's like that meme that's been shared around that shows like a straight line versus like the squiggly line for life.
The real one.
Point A to point B. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. But now, Matt, we want to shift a little bit from this conversation on what your life has been, and we want to focus on a specific story. And it's a story of what we like to call our favorite fail or first attempt in learning or failure story, where you created something, you were working on something, again, in K through 12, now in your higher ed space, and you were working on something, of course, for games, game-based learning, gamification, something related to that. But it actually didn't work. It was your first attempt at learning, and we want to know how that story went and what did you learn from that, what changed after that, and basically so we can also take those lessons and apply them to our daily world.
Well, I guess there are a lot of failures, right? Teaching is an iterative process if it's done well, right?
And you respawn every period.
Yeah, exactly. So so I guess in K-12 I was hooked into game-based learning through my use of iCivics to teach civic government in history class. And that was great, but I tried bringing in more game elements, and some worked and some didn't work. I would say the most profound failure was one where, but it was in June, so it was okay. It was end of the year stuff. We were testing, I don't want to say the name of the product, but it was like this barely created history game, kind of tried to be like the Civilization series, but it didn't work that well. It wasn't fully, it never came to market either because of those reasons. And it just wasn't that well done. I guess that was a grand failure, but it didn't really matter because the students just love beta testing and giving feedback. I'd say as far as me though, as far as a couple of failures that have come to mind, one of the biggest or most interesting ones is one I see when I look at on Twitter about gamification, and I read about teachers creating like what they call themes or narratives for their games, which can be troublesome sometimes. Whether it works or doesn't, right? So
usual.
for me, right. So for me at the time, this is when I came to this realization. So this is where I did learn from it. It's known as productive failure, actually, where is different than other types of failure. Like failure, and you'll learn from the mistake, and then you are able to improve. The academic term for it is productive failure. So in this particular case, I overheard a bunch of students that were really into the Illuminati, which is like this conspiracy theory that the secret organization was running the world for the last few thousand years, right? And there's like symbols on American currency with like a floating eye on a pyramid and stuff. So, and it's a thing on the internet, right? So I just globalized it, assumed everybody would be into it, and I made a history unit where they are part of George Washington's Illuminati. There is some fact-based underlying to that. He has written about the Illuminati. But it turned out only 4 students were really into the Illuminati. And a lot of students came up to me during the project and said, "Can we just do this like a regular project and not the Illuminati?" So in that case, the narrative completely fell apart. That's when I realized that I really needed to work harder to not care as much about narrative, but students' interests and passions. So, by rapport with students, you get to know that some are into anime and manga or manga. I don't even know how to pronounce that right. That style of Japanese cartoon. Some students may like, conspiracy theory. Some students like Minecraft. Not all, right? Some students like Dungeons and Dragons. Some students like soccer, right? So to bring that in, so kind of let the students drive some of the narrative, not be so top heavy.
Interesting. So the learning for you was actually that having a heavy narrative was actually a problem because your students were very, very diverse. That's what you would say would be a key point in that learning experience.
Sort of. I guess I would say that the narrative's okay to have. I mean, I still do that now in higher ed. I give the narrative, like teaching about Google Maps and educational technology. I tell the students that they're all cartographers on this giant quest, right? But I think the problem was I expected the outcome to be related to the narrative. So you could have an Illuminati story, but maybe the outcome might be anime or Minecraft or something else like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So to be more flexible and to be more, I guess, open to different types of student interests, not just the teacher's interest. It's interesting, what's interesting to a teacher or an adult, we'll say, is not necessarily interesting to a kid.
For sure. For sure. I would say that one of the things that maybe happened there was maybe you were expecting and you were thinking that your students, you saw one student into the whole Illuminati thing and you thought that maybe most of your students were into it, and that was not the case. So maybe getting to know those interests that your students could have had would have helped you avoid this. But of course, hindsight is always 20/20. So it's just a learning experience that you will take into account for the future.
Yeah, and actually the projects came out really well. We were using Twine so students were creating interactive fiction stories, like choice-based stories, and their outcomes were awesome. I mean, they really made great Twine stories. And it's funny now, I'm teaching still with Twine, and I do a lot of work with interactive fiction and with the Interactive Fiction Technology Foundation and Bandersnatch, which is the current choose your own. I don't want to say choose your own adventure because they're suing Netflix now, but it's the current choice-based story on Black Mirror, and it was written by Charlie Brooker using Twine. So I tell my students that now, and all their eyes light up. Like, we get to use the same thing that we just watched on Netflix,
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
That's exciting. And in that same sense, Matt, is there any story of something that you would say it's actually the opposite of what happened before? It's sometimes some people feel like very harshly about failure and kind of feel ashamed of something that happened, which I always strive to go against that curve. But I understand that that's something that happens. And in that sense, shift completely to the other side. Something that you did that actually worked, again, whether the first, second, third, or fifth try, it doesn't matter. But something that makes you proud, something that you would like to tell the story of how you arrived to that conclusion and how well it went for you. And, give us all the examples of these things.
Sure. Well, I guess what I've been doing over the years is what's known as constructionist gaming. So constructionist gaming is when you play a game and then you make a game. So I guess I like to think of it sort of like constructivism, where we learn through stimulating and accommodating new knowledge and meaning making by doing, right? And experiential learning and Piaget and Dewey and that sort of thing through playing games, right? Games as experiences. And then constructionism is Seymour Papert's ideas of learning by creating personally meaningful artifacts that may be digital or tangible. And we see this with Lego. We see this with Minecraft, survival mode and creative mode. Twine is another one where students can author stories. Scratch, right? So I've had the biggest success when I teach that way, just across the board. So to me, that is my instructional design. Like, I teach and study instructional design also. But that seems to be the most effective with my students, is this notion of survival mode, reflection, and then creative mode. I mean, it worked for Minecraft, right?
It sure did. It's definitely a big success. So you would say that thing was, and this is like almost a personal question. I'm very curious about that. You were saying that when you use that, it's been the biggest success. But in which sense do you use it? When you use it to create your own sort of, again, I don't want to use it create your own adventure, but narrative kind of games, or when you put your students into the situation of using that to deliver an output.
Sure. So here's a concrete example. There's a card game called, and I use this a lot with a lot of card games too, but there's a card game called One Night Ultimate Werewolf, which is a shorter version of the game Werewolf or Mafia, which is an internationally known game. I've taught a little bit at some workshops in China. I have students that visit from China, and they know where Mafia also. Basically, it came from Russia originally. It's a camp game here in the U.S. You close your eyes. One person's either in the mafia or a werewolf, taps somebody on the shoulder, and then you open your eyes and you have to guess who at the table is the werewolf. There are a lot of games that use this type of social deduction. I'm sure you know a few. There are several other commercial ones here that do that. They're party games, right? So I have students play werewolf and they have to close their eyes and guess who the werewolf is. But everybody has a different role, so they move the cards around. So some people's identities change, like a troublemaker can switch people's cards around, and you open your eyes and you might actually be the werewolf, right? So students play this. I did this in 7th grade. I still do it now in higher ed, but in 7th grade, students play this. Then I asked them about how they felt, because games evoke specific emotions because of things like play or agency, because you're controlling the experience that other forms of media can't do as well. For example, you don't feel a sense of pride, guilt, or shame from watching a movie. I think it's really interesting how Netflix's Bandersnatch, because it's choice-based, kind of plays with that notion. Although to me, it's not as deep as, let's say, Life is Strange or another narrative game or the Walking Dead games where you can change endings or choices. But games do that. So when students are accusing each other of things, possibly falsely, they tell me like, oh, maybe this is what the Salem witch trials was like. I let them get to that conclusion. And then I show them books like The Crucible, which they won't read that book or play, rather, from Arthur Miller until, I think, 11th grade in the U.S. or 10th grade. But in 7th grade, I said, well, you know, all these characters you can make into a remake of Werewolf or Mafia using index cards and Sharpies. And the students, most of them will go and read the book, even though it's several grades above, reading levels above their grade, right? But, you know, I think it's a trap with some education. Like Lexile ranges are ways that we use to level readers so they don't get frustrated by reading text that might be too complex or go in directions that they may not be developmentally prepared for. But yet, if students are interested in reading, and there's a lot of literature about this, interest-driven reading, they will. You know, the Harry Potter books, the last one in particular, was written for, you know, it's at a high school reading level, and there were middle school kids reading the book. I'm not going to tell them not to read the book. So it's interesting. So they played the game. They played Werewolf, right? And Werewolf is survival mode. They take those emotions. They get index cards. Their interest is piqued. And then it goes from game-based learning to project-based learning. And they create their own cards and their own games.
So the idea is that they experience the game Werewolf, they go through all of this reflection, and then they go into the project and build their own index card game, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think that was the key for me for teaching. I still like that for ed tech. When I teach ed tech classes, educational technology classes, I try to let the teachers know that I want them to turn into me a workable prototype with a reflection of how they would use it in the classroom. Not a perfect thing. I always use podcasts as an example. You can listen to your podcast, and then I could have a student have some tools like GarageBand or Audacity or Anchor FM or something, and then say, how can you then go to creative mode and make your own podcast?
Yes.
And that's what constructionism is. But it's even more interesting with games, because when you're making a game, you're creating this interactive system for somebody else to use. So you have to do what Seymour Papert observed is you're having students not just learn or know, but they think about thinking. They become epistemologists. They have to think, how will this series of index cards work when I give them with a rule sheet to another group?
Yeah, you're thinking about the experience of another person or another
Correct.
group of people, how it will play out and what are the possibilities and how will they react and all these things, which is super, super interesting. And Matt, when you're thinking of these experiences for your students, is there any sort of process? I mean, how do you approach, let's say they give you a new class that you're going to teach and you haven't taught before. How do you get started? How do you get started with planning a session or the overall thing? I don't know. How do you approach it? So it would be very interesting for us to get a sneak peek into your head and take a look at how it goes on when you're doing these things out there in the wild.
For sure. So I'm also trained through the Institute of Play's Teacher Quest program. So they founded a school, Quest to Learn, and they do a lot of other projects. Currently, at the moment, they're doing work with Nintendo with the cardboard Labo system.
Yes.
Getting that in schools. So anyway, I use their collect and cluster for the first thing. So in my classes, I did this in middle school, and I'm doing it right now. I just did it this week. So, it's the beginning of the semester. So I put on the board. It's like day one. I don't even go over the syllabus yet, right? I have on a slide. It says what is technology? I forgot the exact quote, but how do you define technology, basically, right? And then it goes in 3 rounds or so. So I have them with a bunch of Post-its, just quietly in groups of 4 or 5. They take Post-its and they just write down 1 word or 2 words per Post-it. The first question is, why is technology important? And then when they're done, or I feel like they're done, I click to the next slide, and the slide just says, where has technology been useful in your life? Then I have another slide, where has technology been challenging? Why does innovation in education matter is the last question. When they're all done, I call time, just kind of like arbitrarily. They should have probably each person 10 to 15 Post-its in front of them. And then I give them paper, chart paper, and I have them then cluster. So it goes from a collect to a cluster. And then I have them cluster their Post-its together, not based on my questions, but what are areas of commonality. So they cluster them together. And then while they're doing that, they're allowed to talk at that part. So round 2, they can talk to each other. So they're collaborating and that sort of thing. And it gets loud, which is awesome. Then I give them Sharpies and I have them circle their clusters. And then we do a share out. And that's the first class. And when I'm done with that, by the way, I put up a slide from the Institute of Play, which is their 7 principles of game-like learning, which are, I can read them to you. It's everyone is a participant. Failure is reframed as iteration. Everything's interconnected. Learning happens by doing. Feedback is immediate and ongoing. Challenge is constant. Learning feels like play. And I put that on the board, and I just say, just take a look at that. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm not going to play, PowerPoint or Google Slide karaoke. We just did this, right? They all understand it because they did the experience first. It's like what Jim G wrote about or speaks about also, like how when we teach, we give students the manual without any experiences to bring to the manual, the way we use textbooks. So those principles would make no sense at all unless they already do it. I use day 2 in the class, I introduced them to Classcraft because Classcraft is the gamification system I use, right? And I don't explain them what gamification is until they build their avatars and their teams up, their guilds. Then they know what it is. So
it's more
very
experience
much
based.
It's totally experience based, yeah. And they really like it. I mean, they're used to lecture, in class. I also play them a YouTube clip of Steve Jobs, and it's from 25 years ago, and it's a really short clip. And Steve Jobs says that a computer is the equivalent of a bicycle for our minds. And these points help to drive home why we're using technology and games in the classroom, because some of them come into the class thinking that I'm going to teach them PowerPoint or smart boards or things like that, not how technology can empower learning.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for those examples, Matt.
Oh, sure. And if you go to instituteofplay.org, they have lots of free resources like that.
Yeah, instituteofplay.org. It's a prime place to find many examples of the actually when it all started in gamification, so to speak. Many of the prime examples shared came from what they did as well. All the work that they did on all these things that came up, many of them came from the Institute of Play. Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's @RobAlvarezB and the hashtag ProfessorGame, all one word. And in Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. So Matt, now I wanted to sort of shift into this second part of the interview where we go more from the narrative that we had before and more of the stories that we had to these sort of more quicker answers, so to speak. They're a bit more straight to the point. And the first one that we always make to our guests in Professor Game is, what is something you think any gamification project would benefit from? Any best practice in gamification, so to speak? Is there something that you would like to say, well, if you include these types of things, or if you think about this or that, it will always be in benefit, so to speak, of your classroom?
Sure. Well, okay. So broadly speaking, there's gamification. More narrowly speaking, gamification classroom context, right?
Yes.
So student choice. That's it.
Student choice, definitely.
Yeah,
Definitely.
and then I would just drop the mic. I mean, it's always about student choice. I like Classcraft, for example. I use Classcraft. I'm not sure if you're familiar with.
I am familiar with it. I haven't used it, but I am familiar with what it's about.
So I've seen them on their journey. In the intro there, you mentioned I went to the White House, previous administration, by the way, and I went there with, and also in attendance was Devin. Devin and Sean, they're two brothers, and they started Classcraft. And, I've known them over the years, and they've known me over I was with Sean in India at a conference back in November. And it's great. They're super passionate about their product, and it provides a nice structure. But one of the, I'd say, like literally game-changing things they've added was this thing called quests. And teachers can share quests. And you create these quests. It's like dropping a pin in a Google map, and you put a story, and then you put when the student finishes that, they go to the next part of the story. And I joke to my students that your reward for doing work is more work, But it's like that with games, right? Your reward for work is more work. It was like that for writing. Every book I've written, my reward is to be a guest blogger somewhere, right? But yeah, I mean, it's just amazing when I do that. And in college, it's really amazing. Like a lot of them have had no choice. I tell them, congratulations, you've gotten this far by playing the game of school where there's little choice at all. You're just going by the teacher's expectations, worksheets and standardized tests and so on, and extrinsic rewards. And you got here. Now, yeah, of course, there's XP and there's all that sort of thing that goes with any gamification system, and Classcraft does that in a nice, tidy package. But the quests are just amazing, and of course, you can do this in other ways, and I've written about this for Edutopia, other platforms you can do this with. But the idea of quests has really been amazing. In particular, for example, I teach ed tech and secondary ed, so some of the students are going to be math teachers, and some are going to be science teachers, and some are in the theater department, and I'm one of the required classes. So I have what I call the paths of destiny. So once they learn something that I need them to all learn, then they go and they can take the theater route, or they can take the science route, and it all converges at the end. But it's very comforting that they can all work together in their own disciplines. And they could also, within those disciplines, follow what they want to learn while all meeting the learning objective. So to me, choice is really amazing. I've done some research on this too. We have a paper in review on this, and it's about choice as an illusion, right? I've had a lot of conversations with different game designers about this.
Sorry, have you read Andrzej Marchewski? He has there's a blog post where he talks about, well, it's a very short blog post. I'm not, of course, deeper research can be made, but it's just the point of that you were going into, I think, about choice and sometimes what he called apparent choice, which is you kind of give them a choice, but not really. Like in the end, you'll maybe guide them towards like the same place. You're not really choosing something completely different, but it feels like a meaningful choice, and that you're choosing that path and you're owning that path that you're setting yourself onto. Is that something related to what you were mentioning? And sorry for jumping in.
No worries. Yeah, and I know Andrew, but I mean, I guess I am more of a game-based learning person than a gamification person, right? So to me, to clarify the difference between the two, I think of why, right? So the why would be for gamification and game-based learning, what you learn. So in game-based learning, you might be learning how systems work and causes become effects for other causes, and systems thinking, how to think like how the designer wants you to think, and have a series of interesting problems to solve. Whereas gamification doesn't really do that. I mean, what's the benefit of my students learning the system of classcraft that I've created for them? It's a lot different than learning how a system of social interactions work with Werewolf, or how the system of global interactions work with a game like Risk or Pandemic, right? So I think about that. All games restrict choice. It's not just parenting. I know this from my conversations and readings and researching game studies, and talking to like Tracy Fullerton, for example, at USC's Game Innovation Lab about this recently. Games play around with choice, even though they seem like you can do a million things, like Assassin's Creed or Grand Theft Auto or an open world game, Red Dead Redemption. They're not. You have to go to like this mission, and once you trigger the mission, you're going from point A to point B.
Yep.
Right? And the game system encourages you to not just wander around all the time, but to follow that. I think that's another trapping I see with gamification also, is that this notion of flow, and students always need to be in a state of heightened engagement all the time. And that doesn't always translate to what flow actually is. Flow can be gardening, yoga, a nice dog walk, skiing. Those sorts of activities doesn't mean that you're being bombarded with 3 stars all the time, right?
Yeah, I've seen as well many people, and again, it's a question of perspectives as usual. When people talk about gamification and it's just about like delivering stars and points and badges and leaderboards and that kind of stuff, it's definitely not what anybody who's thinking of gamification as a serious thing and not just a fad, which thank God it's at least gone away as a fad. And the people who are in it in general tend to be people who are like authentically trying to do something good with that, and not just putting it in their bios and saying, I'm a gamification, whatever. But
yeah, it's interesting. I've been to some conferences lately, and I hear game designers speak still ill of gamification.
Oh, yeah.
But if you put your ear to the ground for education, teachers are gravitating to it. I mean, in some respects, it's low-hanging fruit for some teachers. You go from like the teacher money exchange, whatever they have in their classroom, right, or some fancy sticker system. But there are really a lot of good. I mean, I've heard on your podcast, past episodes of other teachers, and what they've had as their gamification is actually a game.
Yeah.
Right. They've moved beyond that. They've created a real world game in their class. I think it's important. Like, I think of games that have no gamification also, like Monument Valley, the app where you're moving the character through an experience, or Florence is another one. These are like little games, but they're not little games, but I guess little because they're on my phone. But there's no points, leaderboards. You just go through the experience.
Yeah.
There are a lot of narrative games that do that. And there's still you're going from point A to point B in the experience. Going back to this illusion of choice, Some games do that really well. Some games have these loops of choice. And in teaching, what I try to do with quests and student choice is also like a third option if there's two, and that option is like all question marks, like, propose to me what you want to do, right? Almost no student will do that. But it's interesting because you're encouraging that like illusion of choice. I also added a side quest, right? I'm doing like this unit on Google Maps, creating Google Maps, and students are making their own pins and everything. I made a side quest about Google Earth, and a few of my students did it already. So I think that's also a cool thing. They're like binging, right? They're binge questing, they're binge learning. They don't have to. They probably wouldn't even click on that in a normal linear class setting.
Yes,
So
indeed.
student choice is the big thing. The feeling of having agency over outcome.
Yes, it is. It is, and it goes in the biggest of ways when you design the whole classroom, and it goes in the smallest of things. Sometimes you have to give them an assignment, and they can choose how to do the assignment or which of the questions of the assignment they can pick, and that's already giving them some choice, and that starts to change the script because again, some people are very scared of going all in. Or how much time it'll take and how different it is from that. And we could argue about why or they should or shouldn't and how it's better or not. But always taking that first step can be scary, and small things can make a difference. And when you see things starting to work a lot better, because as you said, you give the students choice. I know it's easier to get on board with those things that are maybe small, and then you realize how changing they can be for the experience of your students.
Yeah, I think in some respects, when some teachers may hear like some schools or sometimes I hear this with Montessori learning that students have no structure, right, and they're allowed to do whatever they want, which isn't always the case, right? Montessori is not a brand; anybody can say they're Montessori as a school, at least in the U.S. But I think choice is about curation. So I tell teachers, and I try to do things in relatable ways, like instead of saying constructionist gaming, Minecraft creative mode and survival mode and creative mode. So for curation, I think it's really helpful to think of things like playlists, like a Spotify playlist, or a mixtape, like in the 80s and 90s, right? And that's what you're creating for your students. So you give them like this mixtape or playlist of resources. They can go to these websites, use these books, and do these certain types of activities, and I think that goes a long way, and modeling it and actually doing it in class, not lecturing about it, but actually doing it in teacher education class is certainly helpful.
Yes, definitely. But changing a little bit the script of what we're going into, because we're talking a lot about games, but I would like to know, what is your favorite game, Matthew?
My favorite game? That's a good question.
That's a tough one, I know.
Yeah, so I guess my favorite video game, single player game, was Portal 2. I really enjoyed, I went all the way to the end, and I still remember being excited, winning at the end. I mean, I do enjoy other games. I like I know specific types of games I like. Like, I like the environmental puzzles in Tomb Raider games. Currently, I'm playing Overcooked 2 with my son, which is a couch co-op game. So we are both, he's 8. So basically you are in a kitchen. Right now we're in a sushi kitchen. And we each do certain things, and you have 3 minutes to serve meals to people. But it's, I do one thing and then he does his thing in the other side of the kitchen, and you got to kind of work together. So I think that's pretty terrific. It models cooperation. And my favorite board game is Pandemic.
Oh, I just got that one for Christmas from some friends. I was looking forward to playing it, and I've enjoyed every single time we've played since we got it. It's a fantastic board game.
Yeah, I used it in the classroom. I used it to teach the Columbian Exchange and how smallpox wiped out many indigenous populations in Central and South America. I had 6th graders play this game at a time. And then the other class students in different centers around the classroom would play other or go through other activities, like a video-based activity that led to an essay, some other activities that had to do with the Columbian Exchange in the Columbus's day, as well as some modern day systems like Ebola outbreaks, that sort of thing. And they
Yes.
really understood, like when I showed them the map of the Silk Road, they understood how the Black Plague came over from Asia to Europe just by looking at it because they experienced it playing Pandemic. And it was also interesting that the students would come back, and it happened with Werewolf also. They would tell me, oh, Dr. Farber, I got Pandemic from Santa for Christmas. You know, like,
That's exciting.
did you ask for worksheets also? Or.
I'm sure they did. It was part of the list, but Santa was not nice enough to give it to them.
It's with a coal, I think.
Matt, is there any person that you would like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game?
Well, I've been listening to Glenn Irvin and Mike Washburn's podcast. They have an On Education podcast. I like Vicki Davis's podcast. I've been on there a few times. Cool Cat Teacher. It's the fifth. I forgot what it's called now. I think the 10-minute podcast or 15-minute podcast. It's nice because it's really brief.
Yeah.
Also, so I guess it's sort of like YouTube. I read an article about this recently. How YouTube videos are trending to be longer. Like
there's all sorts of things for sure.
Right? Yeah. But now, I guess like we watch YouTube on our TV. It's not just like on my phone. So I have no problem watching like a 45-minute vlog on YouTube on TV. So I guess it depends on where I am at, in the car or not.
Yeah. And is there any of these persons that you mentioned, would you like to listen to them on an interview like this one in Professor Game?
Yeah. Well, have you had Glenn Irvin on?
Nope. Definitely not.
Yeah, he's great. So I've featured him in my books. When he was a Spanish teacher, he used to use Minecraft in the classroom, and he created all these worlds in Minecraft where the students were immersed and they had to communicate with each other in Spanish. And it was similar to like how I mentioned Werewolf, how students would play and then they would learn even faster because it's mediated by the game. Those are the conditions that he created.
Fantastic.
So
fantastic.
yeah, his podcast is really good. It's I think it's called On Education.
Fantastic. I'll try to get in touch with Glenn. Is there, of course, aside from your two fantastic books, Matt, is there any other book that you would recommend to the engagers?
For let's see. Well, of course, there's James Paul G's book, right? But what learning? I'm not going to get the title right.
Well, it'll be in the show notes. If listeners go to professorgame.com and type Matthew Farber in the search bar, you'll find the notes to the exact title that we'll place it there and link it.
His book is What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. That's like the godfather or the grandfather of like all of this, right, with game-based learning. But I think a really good one I'd recommend is Connected Gaming. Connected Gaming is from Yasmin Kafai and Quinn Burke. It was funded by the MacArthur Grant. And it really illustrates the ways that I've been teaching, which is play and then make. It talks about Scratch. And Yasmin Kafai came from MIT. She's currently at UPenn, University of Pennsylvania. And it's a very easy to read book. But it uses Scratch and Minecraft in particular as examples of how students play, but then they also learn. It's the subtitle is What Making Video Games Can Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. And Dr. Kafai is one of the first to identify kids making games back in the 90s, before we've had all these hour of code type tools out there.
Interesting. Finally, Matt, is there something that you would call your superpower when creating these game-based learning experiences?
Let's see. Well, I guess I would have to say that, I mean, I'd say it's my superpower, but
your sweet spot.
Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people, right? I connect with people. I go to conferences. I talk with people all the time, and I respect a lot of the work and art that people do. So I'm able to bring a lot of that to my students. I'm able to bring them really high quality experiences like, Minecraft education. Breakout EDU is another one I like, these little breakout games.
Yeah.
And I'm able to curate that and bring that to students. I'd say that is my superpower. I feel like, again, like making somebody a really cool Spotify playlist or a mixtape.
It's like the connected curator or something like that.
Yeah, I would say that. Like, I mean, just like watching kids play Pandemic for the first time, and they've never even played a game like that. They've maybe only played like, Snakes and Ladders. They've never been that stressed out before about turning over like an outbreak card, diseases or whatever. Just seeing that and seeing their light bulbs in their head go off, to me, that is what I think is a superpower. I guess it's like, it's like a literature teacher if you're bringing a student a really amazing book or play for the first time that would not have been on somebody's radar, right? I think that's an exciting part of teaching. I know we talk about things like personalization and adaptive learning and things like that, right? Or like what we have like a Netflix, right? Like, if you like this, then you might like this, right? This idea of discoverability. And I think that's something teachers can really bring to students. Like, oh, that's really interesting. You might also like this game or this experience, this film, I think you would really like, right? Yeah, I think that is probably my strength. One of my strengths.
So Matt, is there any final piece of advice you would like to leave us with? Then please let us know how can we connect with you, where we can find you, and then we'll say it's game over.
For sure. Well, I'm on the interwebs, so my website, MatthewFarber.com, or at Matthew Farber on Twitter works. Yeah, I would say keep exploring, keep trying different things with students, and I think there's no magic. I guess when I was teaching in middle school and I first started using games in the classroom, I thought there would be some sort of magic elixir, like, well, I can use iCivics games to teach civics, right? What if I found games for every content area? And that was just too hard to do. I found that this idea of constructionist gaming worked better. Students will play something to feel some experience, and then they get to make something, and then their students get to make something, and so on and so on. To me, that is really an amazing way to learn. So when I gamify, I guess I would say I gamify more akin to creative mode than to traditional gamification mechanics.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Matthew, for the time you dedicated to this podcast, for all the insights you provided us with the stories, all these things. It was a very, very productive interview for myself personally, which is, of course, how this podcast was born, and many of the interests that we share with the audience as well. Thanks for all that sharing. Remember, Engagers, there's the 2 books by Matt that you can find where books are found. But now it's time to say it's game over.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. If you want more details about this interview with Matthew Farber, you can go to professorgame.com/podcast/065. There you can also subscribe, and that way we can be in contact. And you will have exclusive access to opportunities that Professor Game might have for you. And before you go on to your next mission, would you like to know how Philip Bush uses gamification for development and peace? Well, then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.